There are men who lose their money to bad investments. There are men who lose it to bad luck. And then there are men who give it away, willingly, proudly, with both hands, to someone who made them believe that giving was the most noble thing they had ever done. This man was 75 years old when he realized what he had done. He had nothing left, no safety net, no second chance, no years left to rebuild. This is his story, in his own words. The morning I transferred the last of it, I felt something I can only describe as peace. Not the peace of a man who has done something reckless and doesn't know it yet. I mean genuine, full-chested peace. The kind you feel when you have made a decision that aligns with everything you believe about who you are and what your life was for. I sat at the desk in my flat in Manila, and I watched the confirmation number appear on the screen, and I thought, this is the right thing. This is the best thing I have ever done with money that I spent 40 years earning. The transfer was for £127,000. It brought the total to £490,000. Every pound I had left in the world, outside of my state pension and a small monthly draw from a retirement annuity that covers my rent and basic food, I had given it all to Kiara Reyes, a woman I had known for 22 months, who had told me she was a philanthropist devoted to lifting children out of poverty in the provinces of the Philippines. I had given it freely, legally, with full documentation and no expectation of return, because that was what she told me love looked like when it was real and selfless and brave. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I explain anything else. I want you to understand that I was not deceived in the way people usually mean when they use that word. Nobody held a gun to me. Nobody forged my signature. I signed every document. I made every transfer. I said out loud, on multiple occasions, that this was my choice and my joy, and that I had never felt more alive. That is what makes it so hard to talk about. That is what keeps me awake at night. Not that she took it from me, but that I handed it over, both hands, and thanked her for the privilege. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Leonardo Hartley. I am 75 years old, born in Hammersmith, West London. I spent my working life in corporate banking, 38 years at the same institution, rising from a junior analyst position in 1972 to a senior director role in structured finance by the time I retired in 2010. I was good at my work. I was careful with money in the way that people who spend their careers moving large amounts of other people's money tend to be careful with their own. I understood risk. I understood the difference between sentiment and data. I thought those skills were mine to keep. My wife Margaret and I divorced in 2004, after 27 years of a marriage that had been quietly unhappy for most of its second half. Our daughter Diane lives in Edinburgh with her family. We are not close in the way I would have wished, which is largely my fault. I was an absent father in the way that men of my generation and profession often were, and Diane and I have never fully repaired the distance that created. My son Thomas died in 2008. A car accident, and I will not say more than that, because even now, I cannot write about it without stopping. Thomas's death changed me in ways I did not fully understand until much later. It made me impatient with the life I had built around professional achievement and financial prudence. It made me want to do something that felt meaningful before I ran out of time to do it. I retired 2 years after he died, and for the following decade I moved through London in a kind of comfortable fog. Adequate, solvent, not unhappy exactly, but not alive in any sense that felt worth measuring. In 2019, at 71, I went to Manila for the first time. A former colleague of mine had retired there and spoke about it with an enthusiasm I had found mildly embarrassing until he showed me photographs and I found myself genuinely curious. I booked a 2-week trip with no real intention beyond seeing somewhere new. I fell in love with the city immediately and viscerally, the heat of it, the noise, the feeling of being somewhere that did not know or care about my history. I extended the trip to 6 weeks. By the time I flew home, I had already decided I would be back. I moved to Manila in January of 2020, to a flat in Bonifacio Global City, and I told myself it was simply a change of scene for the final chapter of my life. I did not tell myself I was looking for anything specific, Because I was 71, and I thought that kind of looking was behind me. I was wrong about that, but the wrongness of it did not announce itself clearly until much later. I met Kiara Reyes in April of 2020 at a small fundraising event for a children's education charity that my former colleague had encouraged me to attend. He knew the organizers and thought the work might interest me. The event was held in the private room of a restaurant in Makati. Perhaps 40 people, most of them Filipino professionals and a scattering of expats, gathered around a presentation on educational access in rural Mindanao. Kiara was not presenting. She was moving through the room quietly, speaking to people individually, listening more than she talked. She was 46 years old, composed and understated in the way that genuinely confident people are understated, wearing a simple dress and no jewelry to speak of. When my colleague introduced us, she shook my hand firmly and looked at me with a directness that I found immediately striking. Most people, I have noticed, look slightly past you when they are being polite. She looked directly at me. "Leonard tells me you were in structured finance," she said. "Do you miss it?" "Not for a moment," I said. She smiled at that. A small, considered smile. "Good. I always think the people who miss their jobs are the ones who never had a life outside them." I told her that was probably true of me for most of my career. She said she appreciated the honesty. We talked for perhaps 40 minutes that first evening, about the charity's work, about the state of educational infrastructure in rural areas, about what genuine philanthropy looked like, as opposed to the performative variety. She was sharp and specific, and she did not try to charm me in any obvious sense. She simply engaged with me as an intelligent adult, which is rarer than it should be. I left the event thinking about her. I saw her again 2 weeks later at a follow-up meeting the charity had organized, and again at a small dinner my colleague hosted the following month. Each time we talked for longer than we had before, and each time I noticed that she seemed to arrive at these events alone, and to leave alone, which told me nothing except that it was something I noticed. By the time she accepted an invitation to have dinner with me, just the two of us, at a quiet restaurant I had found in Greenbelt, I was already aware that what I was feeling had moved past simple professional interest. I was 71, she was 46. I was aware of how that looked. I was also aware that awareness and restraint are not the same thing. That dinner was the beginning of what I can only call the most purposeful relationship I had experienced since my early marriage. Not romantic in an obvious sense, not at first. What it was meeting of minds. She talked about her philanthropic work with a depth and specificity that went well beyond anything I had heard in polished fundraising rooms. She described specific villages in Mindanao where she had been working to establish micro-schools, small, informal classrooms attached to community spaces, where children who couldn't access formal education could learn basic literacy and numeracy. She described the families she had met. She described the economics of poverty in these communities with the precision of someone who had done real field work, not armchair research. I asked her how she funded the work. "Mostly my own resources," she said. "Some small donations, but honestly, the scale of the need is so much larger than what's currently being done. Every time I go back there, I see how much more could be achieved with proper funding." I asked what proper funding looked like. She gave me a number, carefully, modestly, as though she was embarrassed to say it. She said that with £80,000 she could establish 3 functioning micro-schools with trained facilitators for an entire year. She said it with no expectation in her voice. She said it the way you state a fact, not the way you make a pitch. I told her I would like to contribute. She looked at me for a moment, and then said, "You don't have to do that." I told her I wanted to. I made the first transfer 3 days later, £25,000 to an account she provided for the charity's operations. She sent me a handwritten note the following week, not a typed letter, handwritten. 4 sentences thanking me and telling me what the money would fund specifically. I still have that note. I don't know why I kept it. What happened over the following 18 months was a combination of 2 things that fed each other in ways I couldn't see until it was too late. The first was genuine emotional intimacy. Kiara and I became close in a way that I had not been close to anyone since Thomas died. She was the first person in years who made me feel that my remaining time had purpose. She was also the first person I told, properly, about Thomas. Not the facts of his death, which I could recount without feeling, but what it had done to me. The way it had unmade something central in my understanding of what my life was for. She listened to all of it without reaching for easy comfort. She simply held it with me, which was all I needed. The second thing was the escalation of giving. And this is where I need to be honest with myself in a way that is difficult, because the escalation felt, at every stage, like my idea, like my choice, like something I was proud of. After the initial £25,000, I gave £40,000 6 months later to fund what she called the next phase, training local facilitators and purchasing materials. Then £55,000 for the construction of a proper learning center in a village she took me to visit in the spring of 2021. We flew to Mindanao together, and she drove me along a red dirt road to a small community where I met families, real children, real women, who came up to me and took my hands and said things in Bisaya that the community leader translated as gratitude. I stood in the unfinished frame of what would become the learning center, and I thought, this is why I spent 40 years making money. This is the point of it. I felt it with absolute certainty. I gave another £60,000 before we left Mindanao. Looking back, that trip was the masterwork. Everything that came before it had been building toward that moment. The children, the red dirt, the translated gratitude, the half-built walls that my money would complete. It was designed to make giving feel sacred, and it worked. I was not a man being defrauded at that moment. I was a man who believed, with every remaining capacity for belief, that he was doing something that mattered. By the end of 2021, the total was approximately £243,000. By mid-2022, it had reached £380,000. The projects grew more ambitious with each conversation: a second learning center, a nutrition program attached to the schools, a small medical outreach component staffed by volunteer nurses. Each one came with documentation of a sort: project proposals, photographs, reports from the field. Kiara wrote them herself, she said, because she had not yet been able to afford a dedicated administrator. The documents were detailed and credible. They used the language of the sector correctly. They cited statistics from real reports. I had spent a career reading financial documents, and I found nothing in these that triggered my professional instincts. The relationship between us deepened in step with the financial commitment. By late 2021, we were spending most of our time together. She had a flat in Makati, but she was at my place in BGC most evenings. And the companionship of that, the simple daily warmth of having someone to talk to over dinner and coffee in the morning, was so necessary to me that I did not allow myself to examine it too carefully. I was 73. I was alone in a foreign city. She was the person who made that city feel like home. I understood, at some level, that those facts were not unrelated to each other. I chose not to pull on that thread. My daughter Diane called me in August of 2022. We spoke infrequently but regularly, and the calls were generally pleasant within their limitations. That particular call was different. She had been speaking with my former colleague, the one who had introduced me to Manila, and who, I learned during this call, had been quietly concerned about what he was observing. "Dad," Diane said, in the careful voice she used when she wanted to say something difficult without damaging the fragile structure of our relationship, "I've had some questions from someone who knows the charity sector in the Philippines. About the organizations Kiara is associated with." "What kind of questions?" I said. "About whether they're registered, whether they're verifiable, whether anyone other than Kiara can be reached through them." I told Diane that I appreciated her concern and that I had done my own assessment and was satisfied that the work was real. She said she hoped that was right. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too and that she didn't need to worry. The call ended, and I sat for a while with the discomfort of it, and then I set the discomfort aside, because the alternative was to take seriously the possibility that 22 months of meaning had been manufactured, and I was not ready to do that. That conversation was the moment. I know it now. The moment I could have stopped everything, asked the right questions, looked at the documentation with the professional eyes I had spent a career developing. Instead, I told my daughter not to worry, and I set the phone down, and I went to make dinner. In October of 2022, Kiara told me that a major donor, who had been expected to commit £200,000 to the second phase of the program, had pulled out. She told me this quietly, one evening. Not as a request. That was always how it began. Not as a request, but as a grief. She said she had stayed up the previous night, trying to figure out how the program could continue without that funding, and she didn't know if it could. She said the families in Mindanao had already been told the next phase would begin in January. She said she didn't know how she was going to tell them it might not. I asked what the total gap was. She said £110,000 would be enough to keep things moving through the following year. I transferred £110,000 within the week. By January of 2023, I knew, in some part of myself that I had been carefully managing, that my reserves were nearly gone. I had liquidated the last of my investment portfolio in November. What remained was the £127,000 that I transferred on that quiet morning in March, and then the state pension and the annuity, and that was the full accounting of a 40-year career in banking. I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was clear, and I transferred the money anyway. The reason I tell the story that way, not hiding the arithmetic, not pretending I didn't know, is because I think it is the only honest way to tell it. I knew. I chose. I told myself that a man of 75 who had already lived his career, raised his children, lost his son, and come to the far side of the world to find a purpose worth spending himself on, that such a man had every right to spend himself. I told myself that money in a retirement account, unspent and uncirculated, was just a number. I told myself that the learning centers in Mindanao were real, and that the children were real, and that real things mattered more than numbers. The collapse came in May of 2023, and it came through an accountant. My former colleague's wife, a sharp and unsentimental woman named Eleanor, who had spent her career in the voluntary sector in London before retiring to Manila, had been quietly doing something I had not asked her to do. She had been trying to verify the charitable organizations associated with Kiara's work. Not through official channels, which would have been straightforward. She had been making calls to people she knew in the Philippine development sector, NGO directors, program coordinators, people who had been working in educational outreach in Mindanao for years. None of them had heard of the programs Kiara described. None of them recognized the names of the learning centers. None of them could identify any community organization in the villages Kiara had taken me to that corresponded to what Kiara had documented. Eleanor came to my flat on a Tuesday morning and sat across from me at the same desk where I had made the final transfer, and she laid this out plainly, without softening it, because she is the kind of person who respects you enough to tell you the truth without cushioning it into something more manageable. She had brought notes. She walked me through each discrepancy. The registration numbers on Kiara's documentation, she said, corresponded to organizations in different provinces doing entirely different work. The learning center I had stood in, the one with the red dirt road and the translated gratitude, it had been a real community building. What happened in it after my visit, what it was actually used for, she could not confirm. I sat there while Eleanor talked. I looked at my hands on the desk, and I listened to all of it without saying anything for a long time. Then I said, "The children we met, the women who thanked us." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think those were real. I think communities were used. I don't think the families knew the full picture any more than you did. That, somehow, was worse. That the families had been instruments too." I asked Eleanor not to do anything else, not to involve anyone else, and she agreed, though I could see she had reservations about that. Then she left, and I sat alone in the flat for the rest of that day. I did not call Kiara. I sat and I thought, which is what I have always done when facing something I needed to understand fully before I responded to it. I thought about every conversation, every document, every evening on the sofa with her work spread between us, while she explained the next phase, and I listened and felt useful. I thought about the handwritten note she had sent after the first transfer. I thought about the trip to Mindanao. I thought about the way she had never asked directly, never once made a request that felt like a request, and how that had been the architecture of the whole thing, the one quality that had made me trust her more than anything else. The absence of obvious pressure, the perfect calibration of restraint. I called her the next morning. "I'd like to talk," I said. "Can you come here today?" She said, "Of course." And she arrived mid-afternoon, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table, and she looked at me with that same directness she had shown at every stage of our acquaintance, and I realized in that moment that the directness had never been openness. It had been control. It was the expression of someone who had decided exactly what you would see, and was choosing, with precision, to show it to you. I told her what Eleanor had found. I laid it out the same way Eleanor had laid it out to me, plainly, in order, without heat. I watched her face as I talked. She did not collapse. She did not cry. She was quiet for perhaps 20 seconds when I finished, and then she said, "I understand why this looks bad." "Does it just look bad?" I asked. Another silence. "Then the programs were real to me, Leonardo. The intention was always real." "That's not an answer to my question." She looked at the table between us. The structures were not as formal as I represented them. There were aspects of how the money was managed that I should have been more transparent about. I asked her to be specific. She was not specific. She said things that sounded like partial admissions while containing no actual information. She said that she cared about me genuinely, and that she was sorry I was hurting. She said that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. She said she wanted to explain everything properly when she had more time to gather her thoughts. I told her I didn't need more time. I told her I needed her to tell me, sitting there at that table, whether a single learning center had been built and was operational. One. Anyone. She did not answer. I told her I thought she should leave. She stood up, she picked up her bag, she walked to the door, and she turned, and she said, "I did care about you. I want you to believe that." I said nothing. She left. The door closed. I was alone in the flat, with the fan running and the city noise coming through the window, and I sat there for a while, and I did something I had not done since Thomas died. I put my face in my hands, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not the money, not just the money, the purpose. I had given away a fortune in exchange for a feeling of purpose, and someone had manufactured that feeling specifically because they knew how much a man like me needed it. That is the wound I am still living with. Not the 490,000 pounds, though God knows that is serious and permanent, and has reshaped the remaining years of my life in ways I am still calculating. The deeper wound is that I was so hungry for meaning that I was not careful enough with how I found it, that I had the skills to protect myself, and I set them aside because using them would have required admitting that what I wanted to be true might not be true, and I was not ready to give that up. I spoke with a solicitor in Manila and a fraud specialist in London. The legal picture was exactly what I expected it to be, because I had spent a career on the other side of financial transactions, and I understood the mechanics. The transfers were voluntary. The documentation, while falsified, had been accepted by me as genuine. A criminal case was possible in theory. In practice, tracing and recovering funds that had been dispersed over 2.5 years across multiple accounts would be a lengthy, expensive, and uncertain process. The solicitor in Manila gave me an honest assessment of the recovery probability. It was low. I decided not to pursue it. That decision cost me something, but I made it clearly. At 75, with the financial and physical resources I have remaining, a prolonged legal process would consume me. I am not willing to spend what time I have left in that particular way. Diane flew to Manila in June. I had not asked her to, but she came, and I am glad she did. She helped me reorganize what remained of my finances, working through the annuity, the pension, understanding what my actual monthly income was, and what my actual monthly costs needed to be. It was a humbling conversation. It was also, in a strange way, the closest Diane and I have been in 20 years. There is something about sitting at a kitchen table and looking at reduced circumstances together that removes pretension. We talked more honestly during those 2 weeks than we had in the preceding 2 decades. She did not say "I told you so." She came close. Once. She started a sentence and then stopped herself, visibly, and said something gentler instead. I appreciated that more than I could tell her. My former colleague has not said much about any of it. He is a good man, and he understands that some things do not benefit from commentary. He takes me to lunch once a week. We talk about other things. That is friendship at its most functional, and I value it completely. I still live in Manila. I considered going back to London and decided against it, not for dramatic reasons but for practical and honest ones. My cost of living here, even after everything, is manageable on what I have. London would not be. And I find, on the days when the weight of what happened is not too immediate, that I still love this city in the way I loved it when I arrived. That love was not manufactured. It belongs to me. What I think about, in the evenings, is not Kiara. I have moved through what I needed to move through regarding her, and what I arrived at was not rage and not forgiveness, but something more like understanding. She found a man who needed to believe he was doing something worthy, with his remaining time and resources, and she gave him a story that served that need precisely. She was skilled and she was deliberate, and she took from me something I cannot recover. I do not excuse it. But I also do not pretend it was random. She read me correctly. I was the man she needed me to be, and I was that man because I had genuinely become him in the years after Thomas died. A person so hungry for a sense of purpose that the hunger itself became a vulnerability. That is the thing I have had to be honest about. Not her, me. I was a banker for 38 years. I understood due diligence the way other people understand breathing. I knew how to verify. I knew how to ask questions that could not be deflected. I knew that the documentation that accompanied the projects had characteristics that warranted deeper scrutiny. I knew, on some level, that the visit to Mindanao had been arranged with a care that exceeded what you would expect from an informal community program with limited resources. I knew things, and I chose not to examine them, because examining them would have cost me something I was not ready to lose. What I lost instead was £490,000, and the story I had been telling myself about what the final years of my life were for. Building a new story, a smaller one, an honest one, is the work I am doing now. It does not involve grand gestures or transferred fortunes. It involves the Tuesday lunches with my colleague, and the video calls with Diane, and the slow process of finding out what a man of 75 has to offer the world when what he has to offer is no longer money. I do not have an answer to that yet, but I am asking the question clearly, with my eyes open, which is more than I was doing for the 2.5 years when I thought I already knew. That, I suppose, is where I have landed. Not triumphant, not destroyed. Just honest, finally, about what I did, and why I did it, and what kind of man I need to be, now that the doing is over, and the knowing has begun. It is not nothing, to arrive at 75 knowing yourself more clearly than you did at 73. It is not the return I expected on £490,000, but it is something real. And at this point in my life, something real is worth more than I can easily say.